This very short article is about Divine Evil. It came about because when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor suggested I read a book called Divine Evil and do a series of essays on it, responses to the chapters. And the book really involved philosophers who took a very dim view of the Bible, arguing why they thought God was a moral monster if the Bible was a true record of his dealings with humans. And then various Christian philosophers who tried to defend the Bible, tried to defend God. And I was also trying to think about how could I present the concept of divine evil to year 11 pupils at school, actually year 10, towards the end of their time at year 10. It was really, in a sense, trying to make sense of various Christian responses to the problem of divine evil. And I think actually the problem of divine evil is very serious. And it's interesting that Job, the book of Job, really deals with this subject head on and is given a prominent position in the wisdom literature. So God, I think, understands that human hearts would naturally have an issue here. So the article is not intended to provide an answer to the problem. It is merely trying to set out what I understand to be the problem and what I understand to be the standard responses to the problem. From my own perspective, I think that the issue does merit concern in as much as it is something that, when you do evangelism, is a standard response as to why people are not interested in the gospel. They're not interested either because they don't believe God exists, and that my apologetics work is designed to address that issue, or they believe that how can there be a good God if we have all this suffering? And the answer to that question, I think, is really quite nuanced and not difficult to get across in preaching, as far as I'm concerned. And in some ways, my bottom line answer is, will you trust me? Will you trust God? Ultimately, God says to Job, will you trust me? And I think in some ways, that's really what we've got to say. There may be, and probably are, reasons why suffering exists. But ultimately, for the emotional condition that is created by the person who's going through suffering, rational arguments about why they're going through that suffering may not cut the mustard, as they say. Ultimately, it is an element of trust. And on the basis of all the other evidence we have for God's goodness, for God's sovereignty, and for God being God, we are invited by God to trust him in that area which we cannot fully grasp or understand. And I think that does require an element of faith and an element of submission. But God is well aware that this is a costly submission and a costly faith. And it's interesting that the Bible doesn't shy away from this. David in his Psalms very often makes this point, that he's not happy with God because of things that are happening. But ultimately, he comes to the place of trusting God. And I think when it comes to the matter of evil and suffering, that is really what God asks. Will we trust him? I'm sure there are some complicated philosophical arguments that could be constructed, but I think at the end of the day, because this is a very emotional subject, and one which I don't think we would ever, as human beings, have full understanding of, is probably the best place to start, is that of trust. Trust that God is who he says he is, and that he is a God of love, a God of mercy, a God of kindness, even if at the present time your suffering and your experiences don't seem to suggest that. And God is blessed by our trust in him. And he is sympathetic to our struggles when we find it hard to trust him. But ultimately, all the other evidence that I have presented points to God's existence and that he is the God he says he is. A good, loving, merciful God. Thank you for listening.